Wellington had cornered Soult. The French army had retreated into Bayonne, a fortress city that sat at the confluence of two great rivers, the Adour and the Nive. To besiege the city, or even to contain Soult's army within it, Wellington had to extend his lines. He had to stretch his army in a great arc around the city walls. This meant crossing the Nive. On the 9th of December, the operation began. It was a masterpiece of coordination. Wellington pushed his left wing across the river near the sea, and he sent Rowland Hill with the right wing to cross further upstream. The operation was a success. The French were driven back into the city. The British army now straddled the river like a colossus, with 1 foot on the west bank and 1 foot on the east. But a colossus that straddles a river is vulnerable if the bridge between its legs collapses. Wellington was acutely aware of this danger. He had ordered the construction of a pontoon bridge, a floating roadway of boats and timber, to keep the two halves of his army in communication. As long as that bridge held, he could shuffle troops back and forth. If Soult attacked the left, Hill could send reinforcements. If Soult attacked the right, Wellington could send help. It was a delicate balance, but one that the Duke felt he could manage. Then the rains intensified. On the night of December 12th, the Nive rose with terrifying speed. The water turned brown and violent, carrying with it whole trees torn from the banks upstream, dead livestock, and debris from the mountains. This battering ram of nature smashed into the pontoon bridge. The cables snapped with the sound of gunshots. The boats were swept away into the darkness. In an instant, the strategic situation had inverted. The British army was no longer a single cohesive force. It was now two separate, smaller armies divided by an impassable torrent. And on the eastern bank, trapped between the swollen river and the fortress of Bayonne, was Rowland Hill. Inside the city, Marshal Soult was watching. We must give the devil his due. Soult was a man of immense experience. He knew the terrain of the Basque country better than any Englishman ever could. He saw the river rise, he saw the bridge vanish, and he realized that fortune, which had frowned upon him for so long, had finally offered him a gift. He possessed what military theorists call interior lines. Because he controlled the city and its bridges, he could move his troops through the streets of Bayonne, unseen and protected, shifting them from one side of the river to the other in a matter of hours. Wellington, on the outside of the circle, would take days to move the same distance. Soult did not sleep that night. He issued orders with a frantic energy. He stripped the defenses in front of Wellington's half of the army, leaving only a skeleton crew to bang drums and light campfires, creating the illusion of a massive force. In reality, he was marching almost his entire army, 35,000 men and 22 heavy guns, across the bridge in the city, aiming them like a dagger at Rowland Hill's throat. The plan was simple, brutal, and classically Napoleonic: crush the isolated wing, drive Hill into the river, drown his corps. Then, once the British right was annihilated, turn back and finish Wellington. For Rowland Hill, the morning of December 13th dawned with a creeping sense of dread. The rain had ceased, replaced by a thick, clinging mist that reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. It was a blind man's world, but Hill did not need eyes to know he was in trouble. The reports from the outposts were alarming. The French were not just skirmishing, they were pressing. He rode to the nearest high ground, straining to see through the gloom. He looked toward the river. The bridge was gone. He looked toward the French lines. He could hear them. It is a sound that every veteran knows, the low, mechanical hum of a great army assembling for the kill. The clatter of caissons, the shout of sergeants, the metallic ring of ramrods. He realized then that he was alone. Wellington was only a few miles away, perhaps enjoying his breakfast tea, but he might as well have been on the moon. Hill had 14,000 men. Most of them were British infantry, supported by a few Portuguese brigades who had fought bravely throughout the war but were exhausted and cold. He had practically no cavalry, for the terrain was too broken, and he had only a handful of light field guns. He faced a choice. The manual of war is clear on such situations. When outnumbered 3-1 and cut off from support, a commander should retreat. He should fall back, trade space for time, and try to save his force. But Hill knew something the manual did not. He knew the psychology of the army. If he ordered a retreat now, with the river at his back and the French swarming forward, the withdrawal could turn into a rout. Panic is a contagion. Once it starts, it moves faster than a galloping horse. A retreat would also mean abandoning the ground they had fought for days to secure. It would signal to the French that the British were afraid. So the quiet man from Shropshire made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would not take a backward step. He would stand. He chose his ground with the eye of a master. The position was known as St. Pierre. It was a ridge that ran perpendicular to the river, a spine of high ground that forced the enemy to attack uphill through muddy, broken terrain. It was a strong position, but it was wide. To cover it, Hill had to stretch his 14,000 men into a thin, fragile line. He placed his trust in his lieutenants. On the right, he placed General William Stewart, a man known to the troops as Old Grog. Stewart was brave to the point of lunacy, a man who had often frustrated Wellington with his recklessness. But today, Hill needed a madman. He needed someone who would fight until the barrel of his pistol melted. He gave Stewart the job of holding the flank against the main French thrust. In the center, he placed the Portuguese and the sturdy British infantry of the Buffs. And on the left, anchoring the line to the river, he placed the Spanish troops. But the key to the defense lay in reserve. Hill kept back his favorite children, the 92nd Gordon Highlanders and the 71st. He hid them behind the crest of the ridge, masking them from the French artillery. It was a trick he had learned from Wellington: never show your strength until the enemy is within killing distance. The wait was agonizing. The mist seemed to have a weight of its own, pressing down on the men. The soldiers stood in the mud, water soaking through the soles of their boots. They checked their flints. They wiped the damp from their lock mechanisms. They whispered to one another, passing rum canteens down the line. They knew the old man was with them. They could see him riding along the ridge, his hat pulled low, speaking quietly to the colonels. He didn't give rousing speeches about glory or King George. He simply asked if they had enough ammunition. He asked if they were ready. To the French soldiers massing in the valley below, the silence from the British ridge must have been unnerving. They were used to enemies who shouted, who banged drums, who showed their fear. But the ridge at St. Pierre was silent. It was the silence of a predator waiting in the long grass. Marshal Soult sat on his horse, surrounded by his staff. He was confident. He had the numbers. He had the guns. He looked at the British position and saw a thin red ribbon that would snap the moment he applied pressure. He turned to his corps commanders, Clausel, Durlon, Ryle, and gave the order: drive them into the Nive. At 8:30 in the morning, the French attack began. It did not start with a trickle. It started with an avalanche. The French skirmishers, thousands of them, burst out of the mist like a swarm of angry bees. The crackle of musketry erupted along the entire front, a rolling thunder that drowned out the sound of the rain. Behind the skirmishers came the columns, great, solid blocks of men in blue greatcoats, advancing with the steady, rhythmic shout of Vive l'Empereur. They moved with a terrifying momentum. The mud sucked at their boots, but they came on, wave after wave, a human tide designed to wash away the British foothold in France. Hill watched them come. He stood near the center of the line, his telescope trained on the French masses. He saw the flash of the French cannon in the valley floor. Round shot began to plow into the wet earth of the ridge, spraying mud and blood over the defenders. This was the trap. This was the moment of isolation. There was no Wellington to ride up with reinforcements. There was no light division to flank the enemy. There was only Rowland Hill, 14,000 wet, shivering men, and the cold reality that they were the only thing standing between victory and a disaster that would ring down the ages. The general who never fought a battle was about to fight the battle of his life. The gentle general was about to show the world that the most dangerous man in the army was not the one who shouted the loudest, but the one who stood the stillest. The French columns hit the British piquets. The piquets fired and fell back. The blue wave rolled up the slope. The trap was sprung. The test had begun. The Battle of St. Pierre did not begin with a grand, unified roar. It began as a series of murderous, confused brawls in the mist-choked hollows at the base of the ridge. The French skirmishers, those masters of individual combat, swarmed forward like rising water. They filled the woods, the hedgerows, and the ditches, their muskets spitting death at the British piquettes. For the first hour, it was a soldier's battle, nasty, brutish, and short-ranged, fought in a grey gloom where a man could barely see the end of his own bayonet. But as the morning wore on, the sun began to burn through the mist, and the true scale of the horror was revealed. From the British position on the high ground, the soldiers looked down and saw the valley floor seething with blue uniforms. Marshal Soult was not holding back. He threw 3 entire divisions against Hill's center and right. It was a sledgehammer blow designed to shatter the British line through sheer weight of numbers. The French artillery, 22 heavy guns, unlimbered in the mud and opened fire. The air instantly turned into a tearing, screaming vacuum as round shot plowed into the ridge. The sound was indescribable. Veterans of the Peninsula, men who had stood at Talavera and Salamanca, later said that the fire at St. Pierre was the heaviest they had ever endured. The ground shook with a rhythmic, sickening thud. The British infantry, ordered to lie down on the reverse slope to escape the worst of it, pressed their faces into the wet earth, praying that the next iron ball wouldn't find them. On the right flank, the battle quickly descended into chaos. General Stuart Old Grog had pushed his men into a dense wood to break the French advance. It became a slaughterhouse. In the tangled undergrowth, formations disintegrated. It was man against man, knife against bayonet. The British were outnumbered, and slowly, inexorably, they were pushed back. The French columns, sensing blood, surged out of the trees, aiming for the gap in the British line. But the true crisis was in the center. Here the main road from Bayonne cut through the ridge. This was the jugular vein of the position. If the French could punch through here, they would split Hill's corps in 2 and roll up the flanks. Soult sent his best troops, the division of D'Erlon, straight up the road. Standing in their path was the British 50th Regiment and the 92nd Gordon Highlanders. The collision was volcanic. The French columns, marching to the beat of drums, met the British line volleys. The British musketry was disciplined, a rolling crash of lead that tore holes in the French ranks, but the holes were instantly filled. The French were driven by a desperate fury. They were fighting on the sacred soil of France, and they refused to be stopped. They stepped over their dead and kept coming. Under this relentless pressure, the British centre began to buckle. The 50th Regiment, hammered by artillery and swarmed by skirmishers, was forced to give ground. They retreated slowly, fighting for every yard, but they were moving backward. This exposed the flank of the 92nd Highlanders. The Highlanders were now taking fire from the front and the side. Their colonel, Cameron of Fassifan, a giant of a man, rode up and down the line, his sword drawn, shouting over the din. But courage is poor protection against canister shot. The Highlanders began to fall in droves. The regiment, one of the finest in the army, was being ground into dust. Reluctantly, sullenly, they too began to fall back toward the hamlet of St. Pierre. From his command post on the ridge, Rowland Hill watched the disaster unfolding. He sat motionless on his horse, his face a mask of calm. Around him, staff officers were shouting, horses were rearing, and messengers were galloping up with reports of doom. The right is breaking, the center cannot hold, we must retreat. A lesser man would have panicked. A lesser man would have looked at the thousands of Frenchmen pouring up the slope and ordered the withdrawal to save what was left of his army. But Rowland Hill was calculating the geometry of the battlefield. He saw what Soult did not. He saw that the French columns, by pushing so hard into the center, had congested themselves. They were crowded. They were tired from the slog through the mud. Hill realized that the battle had reached its fulcrum. The British line was bending, yes, but it had not snapped. The French were at the limit of their momentum. They were breathless, disorganized by their own success. This was the moment. Hill turned to his reserve. He had only one brigade left, a force commanded by General Barnes. It was a pitifully small reserve to throw against an army, but it was all he had. In a voice that was barely raised above a conversational tone, he gave the order, "Drive them back." But he did not just send them. For the first time in years, the daddy of the division, the man who checked the camp kettles and comforted the wounded, rode to the front. He spurred his horse forward, placing himself at the head of the brigade. The sight of their beloved general, the quiet man, riding into the inferno electrified the troops. A cheer went up that cut through the roar of the cannon. Hill led the counterattack personally. He rode into the gap where the centre was crumbling. He found the battered remnants of the 92nd Highlanders, who were reforming behind a hedge, bloody and exhausted. What happened next is one of the most cinematic moments in British military history. The 92nd saw Hill. They saw the reserves coming up, and something ancient and tribal awoke in them. The pipers began to play, the wild, skirling sound of Cogad no Sith, war or peace. The Highlanders, who moments before had been retreating, turned around. They didn't just form a line, they charged. It was the Highland Charge, a maneuver usually reserved for the opening of a battle, not the desperate middle of a defeat. The yellow Gordons, their kilts swinging, their bayonets lowered, surged back down the hill. They ran straight into the mass of the French column. The shock was physical. The French, who believed they had won, who thought the British were finished, suddenly saw a wall of screaming Scotsmen rushing at them out of the smoke. The psychological impact was devastating. The front ranks of the French column tried to stop to fire, but the men behind them were still pushing forward. The column compressed, losing all cohesion. Into this confused mass, the Highlanders crashed. It was bayonet work now, brutal, intimate, and horrifying. The French, crowded so tightly they could barely lift their muskets, were helpless against the ferocity of the assault. They began to give way. At the same time, on the right flank, the madman General Stuart had rallied his men. Seeing the centre hold, he led his own counter-charge. In the woods, the British infantry, their uniforms torn and muddy, threw themselves back at the enemy. The momentum of the battle swung violently. The French army, which had been seconds away from victory, suddenly found itself stalled. The Red Wall had not only held, it was pushing back. Marshal Soult, watching from the valley, could not believe his eyes. He had thrown 30,000 men at a single isolated corps. He had broken their bridges. He had cut them off. He had hammered them with artillery. And yet there they were, the thin red lines, reforming, advancing, firing with that relentless, mechanical precision. Soult hesitated. It was the fatal flaw of the French Marshalate when facing Wellington, and now it plagued him when facing Hill. He assumed that for the British to fight with such confidence, they must have received reinforcements. He scanned the horizon, looking for the dust of Wellington's army. He didn't know that the river was still impassable. He didn't know he was being beaten by the same 14,000 men he had started the day with. That hesitation was the death knell of the French attack. Hill pressed his advantage. He didn't let up. He rode from regiment to regiment, exposing himself to heavy fire. His horse was shot out from under him. He hit the ground hard, rolling in the mud. For a terrifying second, a gasp went through the British lines. Daddy Hill is down. But he scrambled to his feet, shaken, covered in muck, but unhurt. He climbed onto a fresh horse and waved his hat. "Forward," he shouted. "Forward, my lads." The sight of their general, indestructible, rising from the mud like a revenant, drove the men into a frenzy. They advanced down the slopes, step by step, volley by volley. The French columns, unable to deploy, unable to use their numbers, began to crumble. The retreat started slowly, then turned into a run. By noon, the firing began to slacken. The French were streaming back toward Bayonne, leaving the valley floor carpeted with their dead and wounded. The impossible victory had been won. But the final act of the drama was yet to play out. As the smoke cleared, a solitary figure rode up from the rear. It was the Duke of Wellington. The engineers had finally repaired the bridge. Wellington, terrified that he would find his right wing destroyed, had ridden across at the first opportunity, followed by heavy reinforcements. He galloped up the slope of St. Pierre, his telescope in hand, expecting to see a massacre. Instead, he saw the backs of the retreating French army. He saw the British lines, battered but unbroken, standing on the ground they had defended. He saw the piles of French dead in front of the 92nd position. He rode up to Rowland Hill. Hill was a mess. His uniform was torn, he was covered in mud, and his face was blackened by powder smoke. He looked nothing like a polished general of the staff. He looked like a man who had been to hell and back. Wellington, the man who rarely showed emotion, the man who called his soldiers scum, stopped his horse. He looked at the carnage in the valley. He looked at the impossible odds Hill had overcome. He took off his hat, a gesture of immense respect from the Duke. He reached out and shook Hill's hand. The words he spoke were recorded by those standing nearby, and they became the epitaph of the battle. He did not congratulate him on a clever maneuver. He did not discuss tactics. He simply acknowledged the magnitude of the achievement. "Hill," the Duke said, his voice thick with emotion, "the day is your own." It was the ultimate vindication. The forgotten man, the quiet subordinate, the shadow, had stepped into the light. He had fought a Marshal of France, alone, outnumbered, and backed against a river, and he had thrashed him. The Battle of St. Pierre was over. It was the bloodiest fighting of the entire invasion. 5,000 men lay dead or wounded on the slopes, but the road to France was open. The myth of French invincibility was not just broken, it was buried in the mud of the Nive. As the sun began to set on that terrible, glorious day, the men of the 2nd Division didn't cheer. They were too tired. They simply sank to the ground, cleaning their muskets, eating the biscuits that Daddy had ensured were in their haversacks. They looked at their general, riding slowly back toward his tent, and they knew. They knew they were part of the finest corps in the army. And they knew that the man who led them was the greatest soldier nobody would ever remember. Guns of St. Pierre had barely cooled when the reality of what Rowland Hill had achieved began to ripple across Europe. He had not merely won a battle, he had broken the spine of the French defense. Marshal Soult, the great survivor of the empire, was finished. His army, demoralized by the realization that they could not defeat even a fraction of the British force, retreated into the interior. The road to Paris was open. The end of the Napoleonic dream was no longer a question of if, but when. Yet as the war wound down to its inevitable conclusion, through the abdication of the emperor, the brief, intoxicating peace of 1814, and the sudden, terrifying shock of the 100 Days, Rowland Hill remained characteristically in the background. While other generals rushed to London to claim their laurels, to publish self-aggrandizing memoirs, or to secure lucrative political posts, Hill simply went home to Shropshire. He wanted to see his family. He wanted to walk his dogs. He wanted to forget the smell of blood. But history had one final, thunderous act left for him. When Napoleon escaped from Elba in 1815, setting the world on fire one last time, the Duke of Wellington was immediately dispatched to Belgium. The first person he asked for was Rowland Hill. He did not ask for the dashing cavalry commanders or the political appointees. He wrote to the War Office with a specific, non-negotiable demand: "I must have Hill." At Waterloo, amidst the chaos of that rain-soaked Sunday in June, Hill was there. He commanded the 2nd Corps, the entire right wing of the Allied army. It was Hill's troops who held the vital ground near Hougoumont, and at the climax of the battle, when the Imperial Guard, the Invincibles, marched up the ridge to crush the British line, it was Hill who orchestrated the final, crushing flank attack that swept them from the field. During those dying moments of the battle, Hill's horse was shot dead. He was rolled into a ditch, severely bruised and stunned. For hours, in the confusion of the victory, he was listed as missing. Men of the 92nd Highlanders were seen wandering the field with torches, ignoring their own wounds, calling out for Daddy Hill, terrified that their father was gone. When he was finally found, battered but alive, the relief that swept through the corps was said to be greater than the joy of the victory itself. And yet, if you walk into a bookshop today and pick up a history of the Napoleonic Wars, you will find endless pages dedicated to the brilliance of Wellington, the tragedy of Moore, or the fire of Picton. You will find very little about Rowland Hill. Why? How does a man who beat Napoleon's marshals 10 times, a man who was knighted, a man who eventually became the commander-in-chief of the British Army, vanish so completely from the public consciousness? The answer lies in the nature of history itself. History is a form of theater. It prefers the tragic, the flawed, and the loud. We remember General Picton because he was a coarse, violent man who died a hero's death with a bullet in his brain. We remember the Earl of Uxbridge because he had his leg blown off and coolly remarked, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg." We remember Wellington because he was the Iron Duke, a man of marble and ice, full of biting one-liners and aristocratic disdain. Rowland Hill had none of these qualities. He was, to put it bluntly, too normal. He was a man without a vice. He had no scandalous mistresses. He never fought a duel. He never disobeyed an order. He never lost his temper. In a narrative filled with lions and wolves, Hill was a dependable, hard-working cart horse. He made the difficult look easy and the impossible look routine. And because he never courted disaster, he never generated the kind of dramatic tension that biographers love. He was also the victim of his own humility. He refused to write his memoirs. When asked about his campaigns, he would deflect praise to his soldiers or to the Duke. He viewed war not as a glorious adventure, but as a grim duty to be performed as efficiently as possible so that everyone could go home. He did not see himself as a titan. He saw himself as a public servant. There is a column in Shrewsbury, his hometown, standing over 130 feet tall, topped with his statue. It is known locally as Lord Hill's column. It is taller than Nelson's column in Dublin, taller than the original Duke of York's column in London. It was paid for not by the government, but by public subscription, by the donations of the soldiers and the families of the men he led. It stands there today, watching over the quiet English countryside he loved so well. But stone and mortar are cold tributes. The true legacy of Rowland Hill is not found in a monument, but in the bloodlines of the British people. Think back to the misty ridges of St. Pierre. Think of the thousands of men who stood in that line. If Hill had been a different kind of general, if he had been rash like Crawford or careless like Stuart, those men would have died. The line would have broken. The retreat would have become a massacre. But because Hill was who he was, because he was cautious, professional, and obsessed with their welfare, those men survived. They went home. They fathered children who fathered children who fathered children. There are tens of thousands of people walking around Britain today who exist only because, on a freezing morning in 1813, Rowland Hill refused to let their ancestors die for nothing. He eventually succeeded Wellington as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in 1828. It was a role he performed with the same quiet competence, fighting hard to improve the conditions of the common soldier, trying to reduce the use of the lash, trying to make the army a more humane institution. When he finally died in 1842, peacefully in his bed, the mourning was genuine and deep. It is said that at his funeral, an old veteran of the 92nd Highlanders, a man who had stood in the square at Waterloo and marched through the snows of the Pyrenees, wept openly. When asked why he was crying for a general, the old soldier replied with a sentence that should be the epitaph of every officer who ever strapped on a sword. He said he was the soldier's friend. In the end, perhaps it is fitting that Hill is the quiet titan. He does not need the fanfare of history books. He does not need the adoration of the masses. He was the secret weapon, the indispensable man, the shield that allowed the sword of Wellington to strike. We often look for genius in the flash of brilliance, in the unexpected maneuver, in the grand gesture. But Rowland Hill teaches us that there is a different, perhaps higher form of genius. It is the genius of reliability. It is the genius of kindness in a cruel world. It is the genius of the man who holds the line when everyone else has run away. The mist has long since cleared from the valley of the Nive. The trenches have been ploughed over by farmers. The bridge that collapsed has been rebuilt a dozen times. But if you stand on that ridge at St. Pierre, where the wind still blows cold from the mountains, and you listen very closely, you might just hear the echo of a calm, gentle voice, speaking to a terrified line of redcoats, reminding us across the centuries that true courage does not need to shout. The victory belonged to the Duke, the glory belongs to the Empire, but the day will always belong to Hill. December the 13th, 1813. The Pyrenees are not merely mountains in winter, they are a grey, suffocating tomb of ice and mud. If you were standing on the ridges of southern France on this particular morning, you would not have seen the glory of war. You would have seen only a thick, freezing mist clinging to the valley floor, obscuring the horrors that were quietly assembling in the gloom. You would have felt the biting damp that seeps through wool and leather, chilling a man to his very marrow. And if you listened closely over the rush of the swollen waters, you would have heard the rhythmic, muffled thud of thousands of boots marching through the sludge. This was the morning the British Army was supposed to die. We are near the city of Bayonne, deep in enemy territory. The Peninsular War, that long, bleeding ulcer of the Napoleonic Empire, has finally crossed the border into France itself. For years, the Duke of Wellington had pushed the French marshals back from the heat of Portugal across the dust of Spain, and now, finally, to the very doorstep of the Emperor's homeland. The British troops, hardened by 5 years of campaigning, felt invincible. They believed that as long as the Pierre, their nickname for Wellington, was watching, nothing could go wrong. But on this morning, Wellington was not watching. Or rather, he was watching, but he was entirely powerless to intervene. Nature, usually an indifferent observer to human conflict, had played a cruel hand. The British army was split in two by the River Nive. It was a tactical necessity to encircle the French, a calculated risk that relied on pontoon bridges to keep the two halves of the army in communication. But the rains had come with a vengeance. The mountain streams had fed the Nive until it became a raging torrent, a churning wall of brown water that smashed the pontoon bridges to splinters and swept them downstream. The communication was severed, the army was cut in half, and on the eastern bank, isolated, cut off, and vastly outnumbered, stood the 2nd Division. They were alone. Commanding this isolated force was not the Iron Duke, it was a man named Rowland Hill. To his soldiers, he was Daddy Hill, a nickname earned through his rare solicitude for their rations and their comfort. He was a country squire at heart, a man with a gentle face and a hatred for swearing, who looked more like a kindly uncle than a killer of men. He was competent, certainly. Loyal, absolutely. But he had spent the entire war operating in Wellington's shadow, executing orders, holding the line, being the reliable subordinate. He had never faced a crisis of this magnitude on his own. And facing him, emerging from the mist with the tricolour standards snapping in the wind, was Marshal Soult. Nicolas Jean-Didier Soult, the Duke of Dalmatia, was one of Napoleon's original marshals, a man the Emperor himself had once called the finest maneuverer in Europe. Soult was not a kindly uncle, he was a predator. He had spent months being humiliated by Wellington, driven back defeat after defeat. But Soult was a master of topography, and he possessed the predator's instinct for the weak animal in the herd. He saw the broken bridges, he saw the swollen river. He realized, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that the British army was decapitated. Soult did not hesitate. He stripped his defenses elsewhere, gambling everything on one roll of the dice. He massed his forces, 35,000 furious French veterans, men fighting on their own soil, desperate to protect their homes from the invader. They brought with them nearly 24 heavy guns, dragging them through the mud with the strength of desperation. Against this tidal wave of 35,000, Rowland Hill had barely 14,000 men. The mathematics of the battlefield are cold and unforgiving. In the linear warfare of the 19th century, 3-to-1 odds are usually a sentence of death. If the line breaks, it is not a retreat, it is a massacre. The cavalry rides down the fleeing infantry, the cohesion dissolves, and an army ceases to exist. As the morning light struggled to pierce the fog, the British sentries on the forward piquettes froze. The mist began to thin, just for a moment, and revealed the scale of the impending catastrophe. The entire countryside seemed to be moving. Columns of French infantry, dark and massive like thunderheads, were rolling forward. The rumble of their drums grew louder, a steady, terrifying heartbeat echoing off the hills. The skirmishers came first, a swarm of voltigeurs moving like wasps, their muskets cracking in the damp air. Behind them, the great masses of the line infantry, the backbone of Napoleon's power, fixed their bayonets. On the far bank of the river, miles away, the Duke of Wellington stood on a high ridge. He lowered his telescope, his face pale. He could see the French columns. He could see the tiny red line of Hill's division stretched thin across the rolling terrain of St. Pierre, and he could see the raging river that prevented him from sending a single battalion to help. For the first time in the war, the great tactician was a spectator. He is reported to have said, with a rare note of genuine anxiety, "I shall take the blame, but Hill must take the risks." For the 14,000 men standing in the mud with Rowland Hill, there was no philosophy, only the immediate terror of annihilation. They knew the bridges were gone. They knew no help was coming. They looked to their commander, the quiet man on the horse, waiting for him to order the retreat, waiting for him to salvage what he could before the hammer fell. But Rowland Hill did not order a retreat. To pull back now would be to expose the flank of the entire invasion force. It would turn a tactical check into a strategic disaster that could push the British back into Spain, perhaps ending the war entirely. Hill sat motionless on his horse, watching the destruction marching toward him. He knew that his career, his life, and the lives of every man under his command hung by a thread. He knew that the next few hours would require more than just competence. They would require a miracle. The first cannon shot boomed across the valley, signaling the start of the slaughter. The French shout of Vive l'Empereur rose from 30,000 throats, a sound that had terrified armies from Austerlitz to Moscow. The ground shook. The gentle general drew his sword, not with a flourish, but with the grim determination of a man who knows he is about to walk into the fire. This should have been the end of the Second Division. It should have been the day the British invasion of France collapsed in blood and ruin. It was set to be a massacre, a victory that would restore the glory of the French Marshalate and break the myth of British invincibility. But history is not always written by the big battalions. Sometimes it is written by the quiet men who refuse to move. To understand the terror of that misty morning at St. Pierre, one must first understand the shadow that had fallen across the world. By 1813, Europe had been locked in a cycle of blood and iron for nearly 2 decades. But this was not merely a war of nations. It was a war of ideologies, of systems, and most terrifyingly, of reputations. And the reputation that held the continent in a paralyzed grip of fear belonged to the Marshalate of France. Napoleon Bonaparte had created something the world had never seen before. He had taken the sons of innkeepers, barrel coopers, and stable boys and raised them to the height of princes. These were his marshals. To the average soldier in Austria, Prussia, or Russia, these men were not simply generals. They were demigods of war, touched by the genius of the emperor himself. There was Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, a man with red hair and a temper to match, who would charge cannons with a saber. There was Massena, the dear child of victory, a looter and a libertine who could nonetheless sniff out a tactical advantage through the smoke of a burning city. And then there was Soult. Nicolas Soult, the man staring down Rowland Hill at the Nive, was perhaps the most complex of them all. He was known as the Duke of Dalmatia, a title bestowed upon him for his conquests. He was a difficult man, avaricious, cold, and possessing a survival instinct that bordered on the preternatural. He had looted his way across Spain, amassing a fortune in stolen art and gold, but one must not mistake his greed for incompetence. On the battlefield, Soult was a master of organization. He could move tens of thousands of men with the precision of a watchmaker. He had been fighting since the days of the Revolution. He had seen empires crumble and kings beg for mercy. To the French conscript, Soult was a symbol of the empire's invincibility. To the British soldier, he was a spectre, a professional killer who knew every trick in the book. The psychological weight of these names cannot be overstated. When a British commander heard that he was facing a French marshal, he was not just facing a man. He was facing the accumulated legend of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland. The French army moved with a speed and aggression that the old monarchies of Europe could not comprehend. They lived off the land, stripping the countryside bare like locusts, which allowed them to march without heavy baggage trains. They swarmed, they struck, and they pursued until the enemy was utterly destroyed. This was the Napoleonic system, a machine of war designed to shatter the will of the opposition. In stark, humiliating contrast stood the British army. It is easy, with the benefit of hindsight and 2 centuries of victory parades, to view the British Redcoat as the inevitable conqueror of Napoleon. But in the early years of the 19th century, the British Army was the laughingstock of Europe. While the Royal Navy was revered as the wooden wall that kept the tyrant at bay, the land forces were viewed with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were small, archaic, and seemingly allergic to innovation. The ranks were filled not by conscription, but by volunteers, often men fleeing poverty, starvation, or the hangman's noose. The Duke of Wellington himself, in a moment of frustrated candor, would famously describe them as the scum of the earth, though he would quickly add that it was really quite wonderful what fine fellows had been made of them. They were hard drinkers, notorious plunderers, and disciplined only by the savage application of the Cateau Ninetails. Leading these men was an officer class that baffled the professional soldiers of France. In Britain, one did not become a colonel through merit or study, one bought the rank. The purchase system meant that a wealthy aristocrat with no military experience could buy a commission and find himself in charge of 1,000 men, simply because his father had the money. It was a system that prioritized social standing over tactical acumen. To the French, who believed that every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack, the British system was a relic of a dying feudal age. However, the British had one advantage that the French consistently underestimated. They had Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Wellington was the antithesis of the French genius. Where Napoleon was a romantic gambler, Wellington was a cold calculator. Where the French relied on the column and the bayonet charge, Wellington relied on the line and the disciplined volley. He had taken this small, disparaged army and forged it into a weapon of terrifying efficiency. He had taught them that if they stood their ground, if they held their fire until they could see the whites of the Frenchmen's eyes, they could stop anything. But Wellington had a problem. It was a problem that kept him awake in his tent night after night, a structural flaw that threatened to undo all his victories. The problem was that he was only one man. The Napoleonic way of war relied on the corps d'armée system. The French army was divided into self-sufficient mini-armies, or corps, each commanded by a marshal. These corps could march separately, forage separately, and fight independently for a day or two until the rest of the army arrived. This allowed Napoleon to cover vast amounts of ground and trap his enemies in a net of maneuvering columns. The British army did not work this way. It was a unitary force. It moved as one slow, heavy beast. Wellington centralized all command to himself because he did not trust his subordinates. He had seen too many gentlemen officers throw away lives in rash charges or drunken stupors. He notoriously kept his plans secret, sharing them with no one, micromanaging the placement of every battalion. "If I am not there," he once complained, "they will do something foolish." This centralization was Wellington's greatest strength, but as the war grew in scale, it became his greatest weakness. He could not be everywhere. As the army advanced from Portugal into the vast, rugged terrain of Spain, and then toward the Pyrenees, the front became too wide for one man to control. He needed to be able to split his force. He needed to send columns to flank the enemy, to guard distant passes, to secure vital supply lines. But to do that, he needed a subordinate he could trust with independent command. He looked at his available generals, and what he saw was despairing. There was Thomas Picton, a brave man, certainly, but a foul-mouthed brawler who was better suited to leading a storming party than planning a campaign. There was Robert Crawford, the brilliant but unstable leader of the Light Division, who was prone to fits of insubordination that nearly caused disasters. There were royal dukes and earls who demanded command due to their bloodline, but possessed the tactical understanding of a turnip. If Wellington gave any of these men an independent army, they would likely be baited into a trap by a savvy French marshal like Soult or Massena. They would be outmaneuvered, surrounded, and crushed. And if a third of the British army was destroyed, the war would be lost. The government in London, already weary of the cost, would pull the plug. The fragile coalition against Napoleon would collapse. So the Iron Duke found himself in a strategic paralysis. He was winning battles, but he was shackled by his own indispensability. He needed a second self. He needed a man who understood the mind of Wellington so perfectly that he could operate miles away, without orders, and still do exactly what the Duke would have done. He needed a man who was immune to the lure of glory, a man who would not charge for the sake of a medal, but who would retreat if it meant saving the army. He needed a professional in a world of amateurs. This search for a competent deputy was not a minor administrative detail. It was the hinge upon which the liberation of Europe turned. Without such a man, the British army was a blunt instrument, capable of smashing what was in front of it, but incapable of the complex, fluid maneuvers required to defeat the French Empire. The French knew this. They saw the rigidity of the British movements. They knew that if they could stretch Wellington's line, if they could force him to be in two places at once, the system would snap. Marshal Soult, in particular, built his entire strategy around this belief. He knew that if he could isolate a British detachment, if he could catch a subordinate general alone, away from the protective glare of the Duke, he could devour them. This brings us back to the strategic landscape of late 1813. The war had shifted. It was no longer about defending the hills of Portugal. It was an invasion of France. The terrain was broken by rivers, mountains, and valleys. The army had to spread out. Wellington had no choice. He had to divide his forces. It was a gamble of immense proportions. He had to hand over the keys to a significant portion of his army, the right wing, to someone else. He had to trust that this someone else could stand toe-to-toe with a Marshal of France and not blink. The man he chose was the antithesis of the dashing military hero. He was not a fire-eater. He was not a genius of the counterattack. He was a quiet man from Shropshire with a ruddy face and a placid demeanor. He was the man the soldiers called Daddy. But the French were about to discover that behind that gentle exterior lay a mind of steel. They were about to learn that the British army had evolved. The myth of the French Marshalate, that aura of invincibility that had cowed kings and emperors, was about to collide with a new kind of British officer. The days of the amateur were ending. The day of the professional had arrived. And so the stage was set. The pieces were moving into place. The global stakes were terrifyingly high, the enemy was legendary, and the British command structure was undergoing a silent, desperate revolution. All of this context, all of this history, all of this pressure was funneling down into the mist of the Pyrenees, resting squarely on the shoulders of the one man Wellington dared to trust. If you were to walk into a bustling tavern in Shropshire in the early 19th century, and your eyes fell upon a stout, ruddy-faced man in the corner, nursing a drink and speaking in a soft, melodic voice, you would likely mistake him for a prosperous farmer. You might assume he was in town to sell wool or perhaps discuss the price of turnips. He had that look about him, the look of a man who belongs to the earth, who understands the seasons, whose temperament is as steady and unhurried as the growth of an oak tree. You would never, in 1,000 years, guess that this man was the angel of death for the French Empire. This was Rowland Hill, and in the gallery of flamboyant, eccentric, and often insane characters that made up the British High Command, he was the most radical anomaly of them all. He was entirely normal. To understand why Rowland Hill was the forgotten man of the Napoleonic Wars, we must first look at the men who usually occupied the pages of history. The British Army was a stage for big personalities. There was General Thomas Picton, a man so foul-mouthed and ferocious that he famously fought the Battle of Waterloo wearing a top hat and carrying an umbrella, screaming profanities that would make a sailor blush. There was Robert Crawford, Black Bob, a moody disciplinarian who drove the light division with a whip hand, loved by his men only because he won, not because he was kind. These were the archetypes of the era, men of fire, brimstone, and volatile genius. Rowland Hill was the antidote to this madness. He was a man of profound, almost unsettling quietness. He was deeply religious, but not in a way that he forced upon others. He simply lived it. In a profession where swearing was considered a second language, Hill was never heard to utter an oath. When things went wrong, when the baggage wagons were lost or the roads turned to soup, while other generals were turning the air blue with curses, Hill would simply purse his lips, look slightly disappointed, and say, "I really must confess, this is rather annoying." It makes for a poor legend. We like our heroes to be tortured souls or roaring lions. We do not write songs about men who are polite. But this politeness, this gentle demeanor, hid a military mind of frightening efficiency. And more importantly, it earned him a nickname that tells you everything you need to know about his command style. To the 30,000 rough, scarred, hard-drinking men of the 2nd Division, he was not the general or sir. He was simply Daddy Hill. The nickname sounds almost comical today, but in the context of the Peninsular War, it was a title of reverence. You must understand the life of a British soldier in 1810. It was a life of brutal hardship. They were often unpaid for months. They marched until their boots disintegrated. They slept in the rain. And they were governed by a code of discipline that was savage. A minor infraction could result in 500 lashes, a punishment that often maimed or killed. The officers, by and large, viewed the men as cattle, necessary beasts of burden to be driven into the cannon fire. Hill viewed them as his children. His secret weapon against the French was not a new formation or a piece of artillery. It was, quite simply, the stomach. Rowland Hill understood a truth that escaped almost every other commander of his age. A hungry soldier thinks about food, a fed soldier thinks about fighting. While other generals were obsessing over maps and glory, Hill was obsessing over biscuits and beef. He would ride ahead of his columns, not to scout for the enemy, but to scout for the best camping grounds, places with dry ground, fresh water, and shelter from the wind. There are stories of him personally inspecting the camp kettles, tasting the stew to ensure the commissaries hadn't swindled the men with rotten meat. If a march was scheduled to begin at dawn, Hill would calculate the exact time necessary for the men to cook their breakfast before falling in. If an order came from Wellington to move instantly, but the men were eating, Hill would often delay the march by half an hour, risking a reprimand, just so his lads could have hot coffee in their bellies. This solicitude created a bond of loyalty that was stronger than iron. The men of the 2nd Division didn't just respect Hill, they adored him. They would march further for him than for anyone else because they knew that at the end of the march, Daddy would have a dry spot and a hot meal waiting for them. It created a unit that did not suffer from the rampant desertion that plagued other divisions. When Hill asked them to stand and die, they did it not out of fear of the lash, but because they could not bear to let the old man down. But kindness alone does not win battles against Napoleon's marshals. If Hill had been merely a benevolent father figure, he would have been crushed. Beneath the velvet glove was a gauntlet of steel. Hill was a master of the professional machine. Wellington, with his eagle eye for talent, spotted this early. The Duke was a man who hated drama. He despised officers who improvised or sought personal glory at the expense of the plan. In Hill, he found the perfect instrument. Hill was not imaginative in the dangerous sense. He was executive. If Wellington said, "Hold this hill until sundown," Hill would hold it. He would not get bored and attack. He would not get frightened and retreat. He would simply stay there, methodically repelling attacks, checking his watch until the sun went down. This reliability allowed Wellington to do something revolutionary. He restructured the British Army to create a right wing, a semi-independent force of nearly 2 infantry divisions and a brigade of cavalry, and he gave the keys to Hill. This was the birth of the Hill system. It was a style of warfare that mirrored the man himself, silent, stealthy, and deadly. Because Hill was not seeking headlines, he became a master of the approach march. He realized that the French, for all their aggression, were often careless with their security. They were used to noisy enemies. Hill taught his corps to move like ghosts. He would march his men through the most difficult terrain, goat paths in the mountains, freezing fords in the rivers, to avoid detection. He forbade the playing of drums or fifes on the march. Orders were passed in whispers down the line. The Hill surprise became a dreaded phenomenon for the French. They would be camped in a village, confident that the British were miles away, only to find redcoats pouring through the windows at dawn, the attack launched before a single alarm drum could be beaten. One particular regiment became the embodiment of Hill's fighting spirit, the 92nd Gordon Highlanders. These were the rough men of the Scottish Highlands, fierce warriors who wore the kilt and spoke Gaelic. They were not naturally inclined to the discipline of the drill square, but under Hill, they became his shock troops. There was a unique chemistry between the English country squire and the wild Highlanders. They saw in his quiet stoicism a reflection of their own clan chiefs. He trusted them with the most dangerous assignments, and in return, they gave him a ferocity that terrified the French. It is worth pausing to consider the sheer cognitive dissonance this caused the French commanders. They were used to fighting the Red Wall, the static, defensive British line, but Hill's corps was different. It was mobile. It was aggressive. It would appear on their flank, strike a shattering blow, and vanish back into the hills before they could reorganize. They began to realize that Wellington had cloned himself, but this clone was somehow even more elusive. However, back in London, and even in the mess halls of the British Army, there was skepticism. The forgotten man was, well, forgettable. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't send puffed-up dispatches to the newspapers claiming credit for victories. When he won a battle, his report to Wellington would be typically brief, praising his subordinates and downplaying his own role. There were whispers that he was too soft. Could a man who hated the sight of blood really do what was necessary when the stakes were highest? There is a famous anecdote that encapsulates this doubt. During a skirmish, a captured French officer was brought before Hill. The Frenchman was wounded and terrified. expecting execution. Hill looked at him, saw the man was shivering, and took off his own cloak to wrap around the prisoner. He then gave the man his own lunch. The British staff officers watched this with bemused expressions. Was this how a general fought a war? By picnicking with the enemy? But they misunderstood the nature of his strength. Hill's hatred of bloodshed did not make him hesitate, it made him efficient. He believed that a battle should be fought quickly, decisively, and with overwhelming force, precisely so the killing could stop. He did not waste lives on probing attacks or glorious but futile charges. When Hill struck, he struck to end the fight. He treated war like a gruesome surgery, necessary, painful, but to be completed with the utmost speed and precision so the healing could begin. Wellington understood this paradox perfectly. The best of Hill, Wellington once said, is that I always know where to find him. It sounds like a banal compliment, but in the chaos of the peninsula, where armies could vanish in the mountains for weeks, it was the highest praise imaginable. It meant that Hill was the anchor. While Wellington maneuvered the rest of the army, dancing with the French marshals, he never had to look over his shoulder. He knew the right wing was secure. He knew that Daddy was there, checking the paquets, counting the biscuits, and keeping his powder dry. This trust was about to be tested to its absolute limit. The relationship between the two men, the aloof, aristocratic Irishman and the warm, rustic Englishman, was the axis upon which the war turned. But for Hill to truly step out of the shadow, he needed a moment where he wasn't just holding the line. He needed to prove that he could take the initiative. He needed to show the world that the gentle general could tear the heart out of the enemy's defenses. The opportunity came in 1812 with a mission that seemed suicidal on paper. It was a mission that required the stealth of a thief and the violence of a battering ram. It was a mission that would target a vital bridge at Almaraz, deep behind French lines. This was the moment the professional machine would be unveiled in all its glory. It was the moment the skeptics would be silenced, and the French would learn that the man they dismissed as a careful plodder was, in fact, the most dangerous kind of soldier, the one who doesn't make mistakes. As the winter of 1813 approached, and the great confrontation at St. Pierre loomed in the future, the reputation of Rowland Hill was already being forged in these smaller, brutal crucibles. He was building a force that operated with a single mind. He was turning the 2nd Division into a family, bound by blood and bread. And he was proving that in the terrible mathematics of war, a kind word and a full belly were worth more than all the gold on a marshal's uniform. But the true test of the forgotten man was not in his ability to follow orders. It was in his ability to lead when there were no orders to follow. As we move toward the catastrophe at the Nive, we must remember who this man was. He was not a warrior god. He was a father, and like a father, he would stand between his children and the darkness, no matter the cost. By the spring of 1812, the war in the peninsula had reached a deadly stalemate. It was a game of chess played across a landscape of burning villages and sun-baked plains. On one side was the Duke of Wellington, peering from the border of Portugal, desperate to strike a blow that would shatter the French hold on Spain. On the other were the marshals of France, commanding armies that dwarfed the British force in both numbers and artillery. The geography of Spain is defined by its great rivers, and the greatest of them all is the Tagus. It slices the country in half, a wide, treacherous barrier that divides the north from the south. For the French, the Tagus was a lifeline. Their armies were separated by it, Marshal Marmont in the north, Marshal Soult in the south. To defeat Wellington, they needed to unite. To unite, they needed to cross the river. But there was only one crossing point left. Deep in the Spanish interior, at a place called Almaraz, the French had constructed a pontoon bridge. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, but they knew it was also their Achilles' heel. So they had turned the crossing into a fortress. On the southern bank rose Fort Napoleon, a massive stone bastion bristling with heavy cannons and garrisoned by elite troops. On the northern bank stood Fort Ragusa, equally formidable. Between them, the bridge floated on the water, protected by gunboats and a castle at the pass of Meribet that guarded the only road approach. It was impregnable, or at least that is what the French engineers told Marshal Soult. No army could drag siege guns through the mountains to attack it. No force could approach without being seen for miles. It was the linchpin of the French occupation. As long as the bridge at Almaraz stood, the French armies could snap together like the jaws of a trap and crush Wellington. Wellington looked at his map. He knew that if he marched on Salamanca, Soult would cross that bridge and take him in the flank. The bridge had to die, but he could not send the main army. That would alert the whole of France. He needed a surgical strike. He needed a commander who could take a small force deep behind enemy lines, navigate impossible terrain, destroy a heavily fortified target, and vanish before the French giants could wake up. He did not send the fiery Picton. He did not send the brilliant but reckless Crawford. He sent the quiet man. He sent Rowland Hill. The raid on Almaraz is often a footnote in shorter histories of the war, overshadowed by the great battles of Salamanca and Vittoria. But to the military historian, it is a masterclass. It is the moment the Hill system was revealed to the world. It was not a battle, it was a heist. Hill took his corps and vanished into the mountains. He moved with that characteristic silence that baffled his enemies. He spread rumors that he was invading Andalusia, sending false dispatches and allowing them to be captured. The French spies were confused. Was Hill moving south? Was he retreating? While they argued, Hill was marching east, pushing his men through the rugged Sierra de Montanche. The plan relied on speed, but the terrain fought them every step of the way. The roads were little more than goat tracks. The wheels of the artillery wagons shattered on the rocks. The mules died of exhaustion. By the time they reached the final ridge overlooking the French forts, it was clear that the heavy guns, the only weapons capable of smashing the walls of Fort Napoleon, could go no further. This was the moment of decision. A lesser general would have turned back. To attack a stone fortress with muskets and ladders is considered suicide in the manual of war. It is a desperate measure reserved for the insane or the doomed. But Hill looked at the obstacle, and then he looked at his men. He saw the dust on their faces, the lean muscle of the 50th Regiment and the 71st Highlanders. He decided that surprise was a weapon more powerful than a 24-pounder cannon. He left his artillery behind. He left the baggage. He stripped the force down to the infantry alone. They would descend the mountain at night, slipping through the darkness like wolves. The night of May 18th was pitch black. The descent was a nightmare. The men had to slide down steep ravines, holding onto roots and branches to keep from falling to their deaths. There was to be no talking, no smoking. The only sound was the wind in the cork trees and the occasional clatter of a loose stone. Hill rode among them, whispering encouragement, his presence a calming balm on their frayed nerves. He knew that if a single French sentry raised the alarm while they were strung out on the slopes, they would be slaughtered. They reached the valley floor just before dawn. The massive silhouette of Fort Napoleon loomed above them, dark and silent. The French garrison was asleep, confident in their invincibility. They believed the British were miles away, bogged down on the main road. They had no idea that 3,000 redcoats were lying in the tall grass just a few hundred yards from their walls. Hill waited. He was a man of infinite patience. He waited for the light just enough to see the ladders. Then he gave the signal. It was not a shout. It was the sudden, unified rush of thousands of boots. The silence of the morning was shattered by the roar of the British infantry rising from the earth. The French sentries on the walls barely had time to fire their muskets before the red wave hit the ditch. The assault on Fort Napoleon was a spasm of medieval violence in a modern war. The British threw their ladders against the stone scarps. The ladders were too short. The men on the top rungs found themselves slashing at the French defenders with their swords, trying to haul themselves over the parapet, while musket balls smashed into them from point-blank range. It was here that the Daddy Hill mystique translated into cold steel. The men were not fighting for a strategic abstraction. They were fighting because the old man had asked them to. Captain Candler of the 50th Regiment was the first up a ladder. He was shot dead instantly, falling back into the ditch, but his body had barely hit the ground before 3 more men were scrambling over him. They swarmed up the walls like ants. Inside the fort, panic took hold of the French. They had been woken from their beds by demons. The psychological shock of the surprise was devastating. The British poured over the ramparts, bayonets fixed. The French commander refused to surrender and was cut down. The garrison broke. They fled out the rear gate, running toward the bridge. desperate to cross to the safety of Fort Ragusa on the other side. But Hill had anticipated this. He had turned the fort's own guns against the fleeing French, and then, in a moment of chaotic tragedy for the enemy, the panic spread to the other side of the river. The commander of Fort Ragusa, seeing the British flag rise over Fort Napoleon and watching the fugitives streaming across the bridge, lost his nerve. He ordered the bridge cut. The pontoon boats were severed. The bridge collapsed into the Tagus, taking hundreds of fleeing French soldiers with it into the swirling waters. Those who didn't drown were trapped on the southern bank and surrendered. By mid-morning, it was over. The silence returned to the valley of the Tagus, but it was a different kind of silence now. The great bridge was gone. The towers of Fort Napoleon and Fort Ragusa were smoking ruins. The warehouses filled with French supplies were burning, sending a pillar of black smoke into the Spanish sky that could be seen for miles. Rowland Hill stood amidst the wreckage. He had lost fewer than 200 men. He had destroyed the strategic pivot of the entire war. He had done it without artillery, deep in enemy territory, against a superior fortification. It was a raid of such audacity that when the news reached Wellington, the Iron Duke, a man who handed out compliments as if they were gold coins, simply wrote, "I have nothing to say to Hill, except that I am delighted." The raid on Almaraz changed the course of the war. With the bridge gone, Marmont and Soult were severed. Wellington was free to move on Salamanca, leading to the glorious victory that summer. But for our story, the significance of Almaraz is not just strategic, it is personal. This was the graduation of Rowland Hill. It was the moment he proved that he was not just a safe pair of hands. He had demonstrated a capacity for independent command that rivaled the best of the French marshals. He had shown that he could plan a complex operation, execute it with deception and speed, and deliver a knockout blow. The French now knew his name. They knew that the right wing of the British army was not just a holding force. It was a dagger held at their throat. They began to fear him, and fear is a powerful toxin in the mind of a commander. But Almaraz was an offensive action. It was a raid. The true test of a general is not how well he attacks when he holds the initiative, but how he stands when the initiative is lost. How does he react when the trap is sprung on him? The school of war is harsh, and the lessons learned at Almaraz, the value of the bayonet, the importance of morale, the necessity of coolness under fire, were about to be applied on a much darker stage. As 1813 drew to a close, and the army moved into the freezing Pyrenees, the memory of Almaraz was a warm ember in the hearts of the 2nd Division. They knew they could beat the French. They knew their general could outthink the enemy. But they did not know that the ultimate examination was waiting for them in the mist at St. Pierre's there. They would not be the hunters in the night. They would be the prey. And Rowland Hill would need every ounce of the authority he had earned at Almaraz to keep his children from breaking under the hammer of Marshal Soult. The sun sets on the ruins of the bridge. The British march back into the mountains, their packs heavier with French loot, their spirits high. They are the invincibles now, but the war is long and the wheel of fortune turns quickly. The setup is complete. The board is arranged. The players are ready. The winter of 1813 was not merely a season. It was an adversary. As the British army crossed the Pyrenees and placed their boots upon French soil for the first time, they were met not by the sunny vineyards of their imagination, but by a deluge of biblical proportions. The skies turned the color of bruised iron, and the rain fell in sheets, day and night, transforming the roads into quagmires and the rivers into raging, foaming monsters. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we must look at the map. It is often said that geography is destiny, and nowhere was this truer than outside the city of Bayonne.